Yeah, as she said, my name is Dan Gardner. I'm one of the ensemble of authors who put this paper together. And I'm here to talk about practices of coherence specifically in massive chats of 10,000 or more, specifically on Twitch. And if you're not familiar with Twitch, it's a video streaming platform. It's primarily geared around video games. There's a video stream in the middle that's hosted by a streamer who's usually just playing the game and they're talking on the video stream. And we did our research on the Hearthstone portion of Twitch specifically, so they're usually playing Hearthstone, which is a card-based game released by Blizzard. On the far side, you have the chat, which is just pretty standard chat. But what is cool and kind of interesting about Twitch and some of the other platforms that have started to copy it recently is this juxtaposition of the video live chat with the video live stream with the live chat, which can kind of respond to each other and speak to each other, which is still relatively new and understudied. In the chat, you actually have chat participants, which we just kind of define as everyone who's actually contributing messages to the chat itself. And then you have viewer count, which is just everyone that's actually watching it, whether they're participating in chat or not. And viewer count actually was really important to us because while we were primarily concerned with massive chats, we actually did some kind of comparison with some of the smaller chats as well, and we differentiated those between based on viewer count. So we called smaller chats those with less than 2,000 viewers, and we called massive chats those with more than 10,000 viewers, and some of them are actually closer to 20,000. And yeah, so we basically kind of were concerned with, or we were interested in this communication that we saw that was going on in massive chats that we call crowdspeak. Crowdspeak is just a collective form of communication that through various practices of coherence that I'll kind of outline as I go throughout the presentation, and we'll hopefully make this make a little bit more sense. Reduce the kind of volume of meaningful content compared to smaller chats. And it's important to kind of note this is different than standard chat that we're used to, that we see in IRCs and other chat platforms, but that it's still capable of maintaining coherence. And we call it crowdspeak rather than Twitch speak specifically because we actually do think that this has implications, or if you were in the AltChi panel the other day, possible integrations with other kind of platforms and events that we might see in kind of popular culture, current events, the Olympics, debates, other political platforms as well. But this theme of coherence is actually a key concern that's been in CMC and chat research for a long, long time. And primarily how coherence is either sustained or dissolves, especially as chat sizes grow. There has been a lot of research that looks at what's going on the far side there, and says it's going too fast, we can't read it, we can't understand it. In fact, Jones et al. In 2008 suggested that chat viewers can only absorb up to 30 messages per minute. And to kind of put that into perspective with some of the chats that we looked at, we had massive chat segments that were moving upwards of 100 messages per minute, with some of the fastest ones going over 150 messages per minute. Hamilton et al., who was looking at Twitch specifically, argued that these massive chats destroy the potential for communities to form through participation. And we kind of go back to Colin in 1978, who observed that computer-mediated communication, in its kind of infancy at the time, was a new linguistic entity with its own vocabulary, syntax, and pragmatics. And we kind of apply the same logic to Twitch massive chats, and that it's perhaps the fact that people are looking for these traditional pragmatics and forms of communication that we see in smaller chats, that they kind of miss the coherence that's going on in these massive chats. So what we did was a bunch of we did some qualitative, some quantitative methods. We did over 300 collective hours of observation, which is that we just watched a crap ton of Twitch streams and played some Hearthstone. We collected 50 message segments from both small and massive chats, 20 segments in all, and to do some comparison. And we did this to test a number of hypotheses. The first hypothesis was that massive chats would be shorter, messages in massive chats would be shorter in length. And the way we measured this was actually in lexical items. Lexical items comes from John Sinclair, and it can be defined as effectively just units of meaning. And lexical items can sometimes be words, but often they're collections of words or phrases. For example, diamond in the rough, which can't really be reduced any further without changing the meaning of the words that are involved. You cannot break that apart anymore. Lexical items also allowed us to look at some of the more image-based communication that was going on Twitch, emotes, which are pretty similar to the emojis we use on our phones, or even large ASCII images of Dog, the lovable internet dog, which that becomes, despite the fact that it's several lines in length, is comprised of many actual individual characters, is actually only one lexical item. at the end of the day processing. And so we did see a reduction in the length of messages as measured in lexical items. And we kind of explained this through our first finding, which is shorthanding, simply the contraction of meaning into smaller space. And this is really very not so different from various forms of shorthand that we use on paper and with pens and in other contexts. You can see it again here on the graph. And basically what this means is that just massive chats tend to look a lot more like the stuff on the left. Smaller chats tend to look a lot more like the stuff on the right. Aside from individual emote messages that will just kind of flare up and be used a lot, you also see really fun stuff that is kind of indicative of the culture that kind of exists on these large chats. For instance, at the top on the left, you have YOLOG, which is actually a whole bunch of shorthanding mashed into one. You have the acronym YOLO, you only live once. You have the abbreviation YOG, which is short for Yog Saron Hope's End, a card in the game. And instead of saying like a long sentence about how like impressive and risky it was to play this card with a really long name, you can say the whole thing with just YOLOG. Our second hypothesis was that massive chats would contain less original content than smaller chats. And by original content, we don't mean like creative and artistic. We just simply mean that it hadn't been used before. And so we measured this as well with lexical items, although instead of just totally lexical items in a message, we looked at the unique lexical items over the course of the whole 50-message segment. And again, we did see a pretty sizable reduction, about half the unique lexical items per segment in our massive chat segments. And we explained this reduction through through our second finding, which is bricolage, which is the reuse and recombining of elements from a small repertoire. And again, you can see this on the graph where some of them were pretty significantly less. And again, this is just to kind of say that the massive chats look a lot more like on the left, smaller chats look a lot like on the right. Within this massive chats image, you can already see a lot of repetition within one message. Despite its length, it'll have a lot of the same image, a lot of the same words. And you can also see repetition from separate messages as well. Whereas on the right, you see smaller chats, which look a lot more like conversational text chat and pretty familiar to most people in this room. Another great example of bricolage is copy pastas. Copy pastas are a pretty cool thing and kind of somewhat not unique to Twitch, but they're pretty prevalent there. And copy pastas are literally just big blocks of text that are copied and pasted. Copy pasta comes from just kind of smashing those two together, copy and paste. And they're exemplars of bricolage specifically because they're built on reference, reuse, and they often get remixed. And so, like I said, they're just big balls of text that are copied and pasted. And you may read it the first time, but after you've read it once, maybe twice, you really know what's in there. So you're no longer reading the whole thing. You can recognize the same text. And then really knowledge of the content of each individual message is less important than knowledge of past activity within that chat. Emotes are also help with this. Again, similar to emojis and stuff that we're familiar with on phones, they add tone and punctuation to various messages and allow you to kind of not only shorthand, but kind of indicate certain meanings and tones without having to type out a whole bunch. And there's even, as you can see, there's an emote for copy pastas, which is a copy machine spitting out a bunch of spaghetti. So our third hypothesis was that massive chats would contain fewer unique voices, and that is perspectives or stances. We measured this in voices. We counted them per segment. And we take our meaning, our definition of voice from Tristan Matu and Rebedea, who did a lot of work in older chats as well. And they describe voices as a communicational position, a consistent viewpoint, syntax, or a style of speech. And what's important to take away from their kind of analysis of voices is that not only can one user or participant take on multiple voices throughout their activity, but also many participants can take on a singular voice depending on the activity. And we actually did not see a flat reduction of voices in massive chats. It was fairly comparable with a slight increase. But when you look at it, at the voices as a ratio of participants in the segment, you actually see a pretty good reduction. And we explain this reduction in ratio of voices to participants as voice taking, which is the adoption of shared viewpoints, perspectives, and mannerisms. And again, on the graph, you can see that in the smaller segments, you have a fairly consistent one-to-one ratio, although sometimes you actually have more voices than you have participants because the same participant might be able to communicate more than once in that segment, and then they may take on another voice, whereas voices never reach the level of participants in massive chats. There's always repetition of the voices themselves. And to kind of illustrate this a little bit more, I have a few examples. So this is SM Orc. You can recognize him by his pugnacious green face, used effectively as quote marks when his voice is taken on. And when you speak as SM Orc, you have to make sure your caps are on. You have to throw out your grammar, and if you're going to give any advice about the game, you have to completely ignore any advanced tactics and suggest only things that attack the opponent directly in the face, specifically. And he's spawned a whole bunch of like really great paratextual kind of cultural references, and on the far side is actually just a thread from a forum about like the best way to use SM Orc and things like that. But he's a pretty straightforward voice. He's very simplistic, but he's also got a lot of character. There's other voices as well. Lull, not to be confused with LOL. He's more than just laughing. He's laughing at people. He's kind of the Schadenfreude voice, or the laughing at the expense of others. Those of you familiar with kind of some of the other like anonymous and 4chan activity kind of comes from there. And then there's other voices that have nothing to do with emotes, really. On the far side, in Hearthstone, you can't text chat with your opponent. You can only kind of select pre-selected communication things, which will go through the game. And so people on the Hearthstone Twitch chat have actually they'll use those kind of preset voices from Hearthstone, and they'll kind of replicate them in chat. And so somebody who might be playing as Paladin, their kind of default greeting is well met. When the streamer on the stream picks a Paladin, you might see like a spam of well mets coming through, people are acknowledging the Paladin being playing and saying hi. So in conclusion, massive chats may appear unfamiliar or incoherent, but crowdspeak is just a different way to produce coherence than what we're used to. Massive chats can be meaningful, especially to those that participate in them, and this requires attention. Future research might revolve around how crowdspeak can be altered by the individual streamer themselves, the topic that the stream might be about, the platform, primary language of either the streamer or the participant, and how this might kind of just change the morphology or dialect of crowdspeak itself. So in conclusion, crowds are getting bigger, people are getting more engaged, and we as researchers need to be kind of like tuned into the consequences of this. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have 8 minutes for questions, so please get up and ask as many questions as you can, and I will start. So I was reading some of the commentary that was at the end of your paper, and I was wondering if you could comment on what is the role of the live streamer in maintaining the coherence of the group?
The easy answer is it depends, but I would say that a lot of the activity, the streamer often orients the activity in the chat. They aren't always in control of it, but much of what happens is in response to whatever the streamer is doing. So I mean, sometimes the streamer might say or do something, and then chat will react not dissimilar to like a wave, right, at like a sporting event, kind of setting off like ripples of certain kinds of activity, depending on what they do or what they say. But there's also times where the streamer would really probably rather wish the chat wasn't kind of taking off the activity because they did something that the chat is now reacting to. And also, it's also kind of important to note that the role of the streamer, with these massive streamers, they have to be fluent in this kind of communication as well, because even though they aren't really having to type as much as their viewers, at the same time they have to be able to kind of read it as quickly as they are and be able to kind of, and then parse it and be able to react to it.
And then one more question. The commentary also talked about other ways. Is it beyond just the streamer themselves or the user? Are there automated ways of controlling the chat?
Yeah, I mean, there's some streamers use moderators and bots that kind of can effectively how exactly this materializes in an individual chat, and that would be something that, for instance, something that would kind of be in our future work, right? Like, so we actually did look at kind of the role of bots and stuff, but it just didn't end up making it into the final paper.
Hi, Paul from the University of British Columbia. So I really love the word voices to describe, the different characters that people are playing here.
Yeah.
Did you notice those characters being modified or changed over the course of the chat in any way?
It depends. So like a lot of the voices are kind of more rigid, right? Like SM Orc is used fairly consistently because he's very simplistic in his construction. But a lot of other voices are a little bit more organic, and some voices may not originate from emotes. They might just be kind of emergent from the chat. And so those can either come and go, or the nature of their communication can kind of alter. An example that we actually have in the paper is we were writing during the presidential election, and so a kind of emergent voice in some of the chats that we saw was kind of like a faux Donald Trump, which was like when a player, a Hearthstone player, streamer would build like a huge defensive wall of creatures, people would just start cramming out like build the wall, or get that wall online, but the words were not always the same, but like the perspective, the position was consistent. Right, so you do see some kind of variations, but you can tend to find some kind of consistent theme that pulls it together.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi, I loved your talk. Brian Hall from the University of Michigan.
Hi.
Thought it was very entertaining. So I guess two questions, one serious, not so much. So I guess the first one would be, from reading all of these internet chats, did you maybe contract any sort of terrible illness from having done so, perhaps one that's fatal?
No?
Second question would be, so I mean, a lot of these sort of participation in these communities, a lot of the sort of, so the in references can be communicating more belonging than necessarily communicating a message. And I wonder if that's sort of, is that something that you've considered, or sort of you're interested in, of looking at belongingness versus sort of entertainment?
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm really glad you guys are asking these great questions, because you guys are asking all the stuff that we have in the paper we couldn't put in the presentation. So if you read the paper, there's actually a whole bunch we talk about in terms of like regulars, and if you're familiar with Brissett and Oldenburg's work on like third places, specifically like belonging ends up being a big part of it, right? Because the kind of the feeling of being able to participate in this kind of continuous space that is that they kind of like feel comfortable in. But yeah, there's absolutely a lot. There's even probably more work than we discuss in there that could be done on that. But yeah, it's a great topic.
Hey, thanks for a really interesting talk. I was wondering about the reference you made at the start of your talk to applicability in other domains, like sporting events. And if you have any idea or speculation about how this might translate, given that those users don't have the technical background on average, or the ability to understand specific references to the genre and things like that. And also given, that that like commercial platforms like Periscope and Facebook Live are already limiting the amount of comments and not letting it get to this scale.
Right. So I can answer the first question. I'm not really sure what the second question was. You were just saying that they limit the comments, but
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying, like, it's hard to see an example of this because the existing commercial platforms aren't letting this happen. Like Periscope says only the first 100 people can talk.
Yeah, so I mean, in the case where the actual participation is limited, if you're never going to reach the level where traditional kind of means of communication are no longer viable, then you probably won't see a form of crowdspeak. To answer your first question, though, just because the iteration of crowdspeak that we kind of see happening in Twitch is reliant on a whole lot of kind of there's some tech savviness there too, and also like certain internet, pop culture references that many sports fans may or may not get. I'm not going to assume that, because they're sports fans, they don't know a lot of the some of the same translatable stuff. But I mean, some of them, like for instance, SM Orc or Speaking as a Paladin, are very Twitch Hearthstone specific, right? So you won't see people likely saying "well met" in like a League of Legends Twitch chat, right? So